Okay, everybody. This is the first lecture on bureaucracy. I'm going to cover just some basics of it and just share with you my PowerPoint. I'm wearing the headphones because I'm in my office, which is a little echoey, and my headphones allow me to hear my voice better. So if you have questions about this after you watch it, feel free to email me questions. And if you want me to just call you so I can talk to you, go ahead and leave me your phone number, and I have no trouble giving you a call. Okay, so here we go. Let's get started. I'm going to share with you my unit on my PowerPoint on the bureaucracy, and I'm just going to talk about it as we go through. Like I said in my other video, it's not super exciting. It's not the way I prefer to do this, but this is what I have to do, and this is the format I'm going to use. So here we go. All right. So let's go ahead and share my bureaucracy PowerPoint with you here, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to, no, not do that. Let's make that over there, make that bigger. Okay, so we'll start off with this unit, bureaucracy and federal courts. I'm just going to start covering the bureaucracy right now, okay? All right, so here's an example of our newest part of the bureaucracy. It's Department of Homeland Security. I just show you this to give you an example of how many different government agencies and commissions there are within just one of the departments within there, just to give you an idea of the vastness of this. So here we go. So I'm going to skip past this cartoon because I don't have the time to talk to you and have you, this is making fun of the bureaucracy and all the acronyms that come about. All right, so let's define what the bureaucracy is right here. The bureaucracy are all the agencies, all the departments, all the commissions that are within the executive branch, and the bureaucracy is responsible for enforcing laws that Congress pass. Okay, so for example, the IRS is a bureaucratic agency inside the Department of Treasury that's responsible for enforcing tax law that is written by Congress, specifically the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee and the Senate. And so that's what we say the bureaucracy. It's all the people that work in the executive branch enforcing laws that Congress has written. So, for example, my cousin's husband is in the FBI. The FBI is the Federal Bureau of Investigation inside the Justice Department, and that's part of the bureaucracy. Every person that technically works as a person in the military, they're in the bureaucracy because they all work as under the executive branch, okay? So I'm just reviewing right here where it says Executive Office of the President. We went over that last unit when we talked about the President. People that work inside the White House, like the Office of Management and Budget, the National Security Council, other people like the President's Chief of Staff, those are all people that work inside the bureaucracy. Okay, forgive me on that. Had to take a phone call real quick. Okay, so now let's continue, go down to government corporations. These government corporations, these are examples of government corporations, and they act like a business. The Postal Service is a government corporation that they charge people money for delivering the mail, and they operate like a traditional business as they're supposed to be making a profit and everything like that. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, was started under President Roosevelt during the Great Depression, and that operates like a business. They generate hydroelectricity and then sell that electricity on the open market. So these are just examples. The FDIC is Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. These are examples of bureaucratic agencies that act like a private corporation, but they're a government corporation, okay? Independent executive agencies, notice I put here, they're organized like a cabinet, but they lack official cabinet status. So for example, NASA, FEMA, these are independent executive agencies, but they're not part of the president's cabinet. For example, the Department of Defense, the Department of Education, the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy, those are all departments inside the president's cabinet. So the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Commerce is going to be in the president's cabinet because they're the head of one of the actual departments. NASA and FEMA, they are organized just like cabinets, but they lack official cabinet status. And so they're not technically in the president's cabinet. Okay, let's take a look at this. This is showing you the growth of the bureaucracy over time. The blue line is showing us the federal employees that work for the federal government and the federal bureaucracy. The green is showing us state bureaucrats, and then the red is showing us local bureaucrats. And there's a big misconception about this because it looks like the federal government has not grown in bureaucracy over the last, say, 50, 60 years, while the local and the state governments have. And this is really deceiving because what's happened is the federal government has increased their grant money. Remember block grants and categorical grants from all the way back from Unit 1? And when the federal government gives block grants and categorical grants to the local and state governments, those government bureaucracies have been forced to expand because they have to be in compliance with all the block and categorical grant money they've received. So while it may look like the federal government has become more efficient, because even as our population's grown, they haven't grown, they really have. They just increased the number of state and local bureaucrats. Plus, this is deceiving because there's about 12 million people that work for the federal government as contractors. And so those people are not technically bureaucrats, but they are only paid by the federal government. So, all right. Next, let's talk about here. So the civil service system is how you actually get your job through the federal government's bureaucracy. It didn't used to be that way. We used to start off with, we used to have what's called the spoils system, or what's known as patronage. I believe it was Andrew Jackson had the quote, "To the winner goes the spoils," because Andrew Jackson was kind of shown as being the first president to just give jobs in the government to people that were politically loyal to him and his political allies, regardless if they were fit or qualified for the job or not. So whenever you see spoils system or patronage, that's referred to as giving jobs in the government to the president's political allies. That still happens in the United States, but only at the very top levels. So something like 97% of all people that work for the federal government do not get the job because of their political loyalties to the president. But the top levels do. So everybody that is appointed in the president's cabinet, so the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Interior, all those top secretaries, and everybody that works in the White House, and then all the key leaders in the department, those are all patronage jobs. Those people are given jobs based off either their political loyalty to the president or their public ideology, or their political ideology being Republican or Democrat. So all the top level officials right now in the federal government are all Republicans because they were either politically loyal to President Trump or loyal to the Republican Party. There are some exceptions in there, but for the most part. The Pendleton Act was a piece of legislation attempting to get rid of the spoils system. The Pendleton Act said we are going to hire people for government jobs based off merit, and that's what I have here. The merit means that you get the job because you're the most qualified for the job. You get a job in the government because of your qualifications and based off your capability and what's called your fitness for the job, not based off who you know or your political loyalties. Okay. So for example, I mentioned my cousin's husband got into the FBI. He couldn't just get the job because of who he knows. He had to take a physical fitness test. He had to pass a written test. He had to do a psychological test. He had to pass a firearms test. He had to pass a technical test. So he had to test in to show that he was qualified through the civil service system. Okay. And that's typically how most people work there. So the vast majority of people, like 97% of people, were in those jobs in the government before Donald Trump became president, and they're going to stay in those jobs after Donald Trump leaves. Only the very top few percentage of people are still given jobs based off patronage. Okay. And so, like I said down here, there's 45 million people that work for the federal government, but that's really a miscalculation because there's about 12 million people that are contracted by the federal government. And so they are technically not on as a government payroll, but they're paid directly by the government. Okay. All right. I'm going to skip past this here. And there we go. So I'm just showing you here what it is that it's deceiving saying that the federal government has not grown. Okay. All right. So now, independent regulatory commissions. These are part of the bureaucracy, and the main function of an independent regulatory commission is to regulate some aspect of the economy. And they're called independent because the president cannot tell them what to do. Unlike other bureaucratic agencies, like the State Department, like the Commerce Department, like the Labor Department, the president can issue executive orders to those other cabinets, and they have to follow the executive orders. Independent regulatory agencies or commissions do not have to follow president executive orders. In fact, the president does appoint members to these independent regulatory commissions, and they're all approved by the Senate, as are other top members of the president's cabinet. But once they're there, they're independent. Okay, for example, like I said down here, the Federal Reserve Board, they control monetary policy. Jerome Powell is currently the chairman of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve does not have to listen to the president at all. The Federal Reserve controls monetary policy independently. The president can be unhappy about it, and the president has criticized the Federal Reserve in recent times about what he doesn't like about their monetary policy. But the president has no control over how the Federal Reserve operates. They are an independent regulatory commission. The Securities and Exchange Commission right here, the SEC, is another example of an independent regulatory agency. They operate independently. The president gets to appoint members to these independent regulatory agencies, but they do not have to answer to the president. They operate on an independent basis. Okay? All right. We say that independent regulatory commissions have quasi-legislative power and they have quasi-judicial power. The reason for that is Congress writes these broadly worded laws, and this is actually all members of the bureaucracy have quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial power, but we say that they have quasi-legislative power because Congress writes these broadly worded pieces of legislation, and it's up to the bureaucracy to fill in the blanks. And it's up to the bureaucracy to fill in the gaps that the law was so vague in. So sometimes sometimes the bureaucratic agency has to write rules and regulations to deal with a situation which isn't specifically written into a law that Congress has passed. So for example, the Ways and Means Committee in the House and the Finance Committee in the Senate write a tax law, and then the IRS has to implement that tax law. Sometimes there's gray area, and sometimes there's situations which arise of which the law specifically does not address. This gives the ability of the IRS to write rules and regulations on how to deal with that situation going forward. And so we say that they sort of have quasi-legislative power because they are in essence sort of writing laws at that point. They're writing a situation of how to deal with, of which was not written by Congress. And so we say they have quasi-legislative power. We also say that some of these agencies, they have quasi-judicial power. That is, they can hand out fines to people. For example, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, they issued a fine to CBS one time when Janet Jackson did a Super Bowl show. Janet Jackson performed at a Super Bowl halftime show, and she ended up accidentally exposing herself. And the FCC fined CBS for that happening. So they're acting sort of like a judge handing down punishment, okay? So one possible argumentative essay we could say is I would have you turn to each other and talk about this right now if you were in class, but you're not, which is why this is so boring, me talking to the video, right? I would say our independent regulatory agencies and their quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial power, are they unconstitutional? Are we having unelected bureaucrats who have not been given any authority in the Constitution to actually write laws and hand down judicial decisions? That is, are the bureaucracies, are they actually usurping legislative making power and judicial branch power? And so I would have you turn to your neighbor and discuss and give an answer for yes, give an answer for no, things like that. So the argument in favor of that is you would say, yes, there's nothing in the Constitution which gives bureaucratic agencies the power to write laws. The argument against that is that there's no way Congress can write a specific enough law to deal with every single situation that's out there. And we need to have legislators with this quasi-legislative power to fill in the blanks. Otherwise, we would never be able to have any law at all. So that would be the example there, okay? I show you this right here. This is an example of how bureaucrats get paid. People in the bureaucracy do not get paid based off success rates. People in the bureaucracy do not get paid based off if they've had good job performance or bad job performance. People in the bureaucracy get paid based off this, the pay scale. And so this is how many years a bureaucrat has been there. And so this would be 2 years, 7 years, 15 years. And this is steps for usually for taking classes and increasing your qualification through taking classes. And so the more steps you climb, the more classes you take, and the more years you serve, the higher your pay goes. So the example that I would use would be like in teaching. Teachers don't get paid based off how well their students perform or whether students want to take their class or whether they've had success in their class or not. Teachers get paid based off years of experience and how many classes they've taken. And so this kind of creates an incentive for bureaucrats to just not mess up. If you can just stay in the job and not make mistakes and just keep taking more classes, then under that system, you are more qualified and your pay goes up. So that's just a little bit of an incentive there that goes along with that. Now that is put in place to have job security. So every time we don't get politicians elected or unelected, they just bring in all new people and just fire everybody else. So it's very difficult to fire a bureaucrat. I think I had some stats one year that said in the year 2014, the federal government fired less than 0.1% of all of its employees in a year, which is an extremely low amount. The private sector, you get turnover, which is way higher than that. So. Okay, so this is the number of rules and regulations that are put in what's called the Federal Registry. And every time a bureaucrat or a bureaucratic agency writes a rule or a regulation, it has to go in the Federal Registry. And so you can see since 1950, the number of pages, this is pages and thousands of pages that have been published, and we have way more and more and more regulations about what businesses can and cannot do, individuals can and cannot do. I'll give you an example. This is an example of a local regulation, not a federal regulation. With the coronavirus, local governments have lifted the regulation that said that alcohol delivery to homes can't take place. So for example, I know that down on Main Street, Barrel House Brewing has started delivering beer to people's houses. They were not allowed to do that. There was a regulation in place which prohibited that from happening. Now, why that is, I'm not going to go into that, but that regulation has been lifted. I'll give you another regulation which has been lifted just recently. Doctors can now do Zoom health meetings or live health meetings with their patients without seeing them. That regulation was not allowed before the coronavirus hit. So sometimes these regulations are put in place for public safety and they're useful. Other times regulations are put in place for protection of certain industries, and special interests get a lot of these put in place as well. I'll let you read this quote here. So reading this quote, this would be obviously an argument saying that, I know I'm not supposed to touch my face right now, right? Reading this argument, we would be saying that bureaucracies are anti-democratic, and this would be an argument that we should not have bureaucracies, or bureaucracies are inherently not very good. Okay, so I've already gone over what's called quasi-legislative power. You might also see it as discretionary authority. They're a little bit different. Discretionary authority means that when a situation arises and there is no clear law saying what to do, the bureaucratic agency or the bureaucrat themselves would have the power to choose various courses of action of what the right thing to handle that situation would be. And so that's another form of legislative making, we would say, that a situation arises, a law has been written, and the law is vague and gray for the one situation that the bureaucratic agency or the bureaucrat is facing. And so they would get to choose what the right course of action would be, and then would be able to write a regulation on that. So sometimes that's referred to as discretionary authority, not necessarily quasi-legislative power. Quasi-legislative power would be where they really do write regulations that go into federal registry, and it sticks now as it has the enforcement of a law almost. Discretionary authority is where a bureaucrat or an agency has several different options, and then they get to choose what the right course of action would be when the law is not very clear. Our current president has prided himself on getting rid of a lot of rules and regulations. So he actually put an executive order in place that said for every new rule or regulation that gets put into place, I believe he said that 2 or 3 had to be removed. And he claims right now that for every rule or regulation that's been put in place under his presidency, 12 have been removed. Now, I'm not sure how truthful that is, but those are claims that they make, okay? Okay, let's keep going here. Power of the bureaucracy, what am I going here? All right, very good. Okay, so this would be a cartoon that would be against rules and regulations. This is President Obama, and we have a hardworking blue-collar American, and it's showing that he is taking all the risk of having a business. He's working hard. He's paying his taxes. He's dealing with all the rules and regulations. And the cartoon is trying to say that all these taxes, all these rules and regulations are a drag on his business. And then you have President Obama saying, you didn't become a success on your own. Somebody else did that. And that's from a quote during President Obama's presidency. And you can go YouTube that. Just if you go to YouTube and say, you didn't build that, it'll be chopped up and taken out of context. But the cartoon is trying to tell us that taxes and regulations are a drag on business, and they make it very, very difficult for any business to actually be successful no matter how hard they work or how much risk they take on. Okay. So again, I was talking about how it is that people get into the bureaucracy, and it's actually about 97% get into the bureaucracy by merit. That is, they have to prove that they are capable and qualified for the job. There are ways to get around that. There are ways to still get jobs that are gotten on merit. Specifically, there are bonus points given on hiring people that have certain qualifications. You can write a job description for somebody that is specific to their qualification, where they're the only ones that is qualified for the job. So, for example, I've seen for teaching, we're in bureaucracy, I've seen job descriptions for teachers written specifically for one candidate and one candidate only, and they would be the only one qualified for the job. So while they did test in and they did interview and they are the most qualified person for the job, it's because the job was written specifically for that person to get it, and nobody else would be as qualified for that. So once you become a bureaucrat, it's very, very difficult to get fired. Once you get into the government bureaucracy, they have a very low rate of firing. It's a very, very secure job. It just is, not so much as the private sector. So one of the trade-offs of working for a bureaucracy is typically your pay is lower than the private sector, but your job security is much higher than the private sector. I'm going to go past this. Okay. I think I'm going to talk about this, and then I will stop, I believe, right here and have this be part 1 of bureaucracy. Yeah, this will be a good stopping point. Okay. So what is it that prevents bureaucrats from just becoming out of control? What is it that stops a bureaucrat from just having tons and tons and tons of power and taking tons of action? Okay. The sheer size of our bureaucracy, okay, 3 million people work for the federal government. Another 7 to 12 million people are contractors. It really stops an individual from actually being able to take bold actions because they have to go through so many layers of the bureaucracy to get anything done. So just the sheer size of the bureaucracy really prevents an individual bureaucrat from getting things done. That actually also stops many bureaucrats that want to get things done at the top level from getting things done. And we refer to this as red tape. All the rules, all the regulations, all the constraints that are put in place are referred to as red tape. So if you hear somebody saying, I'm trying to get this done for my business, but there's tons of red tape, they're talking about the rules and regulations and the procedures that bureaucrats have to go through in order to do anything at all. And so there really is a lack of incentive to take bold action because bureaucrats don't get paid based off bold action. Bureaucrats, they get paid based off how many years of service they have and how many classes they've taken to be qualified. Now, where they can have an incentive is if they can then move to the private sector. If they can take their work in the government bureaucracy and get hired in the private sector, then it can become pretty lucrative. If you remember what that's called, where people move in and out of government from private sector to public, think about that in your head there. That's correct. That's called the revolving door. Good class. I'm pretending like you're all here right now because this is boring with me talking to myself. So that's called the revolving door. And so many people in the bureaucracy can parlay their experience in the bureaucracy with jobs in the private sector, which would be much more lucrative, but also not as secure as well. Okay. All right. We say that the bureaucracy has a divided loyalty to the president, meaning that are the bureaucrats loyal to the president, who is the president while they're serving? Are the bureaucrats loyal to their department? Or are the bureaucrats loyal to Congress, who funds them? Or are the bureaucrats loyal to the people in the United States government that they serve? And so many times we say that the president doesn't depend on the bureaucracy and the cabinet as much because of those divided loyalties. The president tends to rely on their White House, executive office in the White House, because those people serve at the pleasure of the president. They were all directly appointed by the president. Okay. The Hatch Act. The Hatch Act prevents federal bureaucrats from being too politically active. So if you are a member of a federal bureaucracy, you're very limited in your political activeness you can be because there's a conflict of interest. You know, if you work for the Defense Department and you campaign for a president who is pro-military, well, there's a conflict of interest, right? You're going to get more money for that. The Freedom of Information Act allows you to access public documents from federal bureaucracies as long as they're not deemed vital for national security or top secret, whatever that may be. So you can put in requests for documents and they're supposed to get those documents back to you in a limited amount of time. If you remember Sophia last year, Sophia was trying to fight the dress code and she went down to the Visalia Unified School District and under the Freedom of Information Act, requested documents from them. She did that because I directed her to do that. So there we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about how can we control the bureaucracy if they get too much out of control or if they get too big and too restrained there. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing this right here. That'll be part one of the bureaucracy. I'm not sure how long that was, but it seemed to me like it was forever because it's just me talking and I probably went way too fast and I probably lessened things out. So again, if you watch this and you have any questions, please email me. And if you want to talk, you can give me your phone number and we can go over those things. Okay.